Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about. I thought that I would talk about a couple of videos that I found very, very interesting. I may be a little bit quicker with these videos because I do want to talk on them right now. I just, a little bit limited on time, but if I do have to stretch it out and make it as lengthy as possible, then I will because, of course, I do want to make a good quality video. But anyways, when it comes down to it, the boxing world, of course, has been shaken up after that great fight yesterday with Showtime Sean Porter and Terence Bud Crawford. And of course, for those of you that have not heard, Terence Bud Crawford ended up getting another victory in his career and still remains undefeated. And like I said, I have to give Terence Bud Crawford a hell of a lot of credit because when it comes down to it, like I said, Sean Porter, in my opinion, was going to be he was going to be the first official A-grade fighter that Terence Crawford really had ever fought in his career. And I know a lot of people, I don't know, they'll say, oh, well, what do you got to say now about Victor Postal and those other guys? Well, I think that those guys are decent fighters, but I would not call them A-grade fighters. And we're going to talk about his whole entire resume in this video. In this video, we're really going to talk about everything. We're going to talk about the whole boxing plane, in my opinion. We're going to talk about Canelo Alvarez's future. We're going to talk about Terence Crawford's future, Errol Spence Jr.'s future. We're going to be talking about a lot of fighters, especially the top 5 pound for pound, which means certain fighters like Terence Crawford, maybe Alexander Usyk, a Tyson Fury, Canelo Alvarez certainly, and Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., certain guys like that. So certain guys like that are going to be included in this video because I wanted to talk about what I think are the biggest fights on the horizon for those guys. And I just wanted to talk about, what it would mean if they get certain wins. Not only that, but of course I wanted to review a couple of videos just to see what some other people said. And we're going to start off with AKHi TV here. And if I have time, I will review a Fan International boxing video as well, just because I want to get into the conversation of Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford a little bit more. But I wanted to review this video first and foremost because, of course, what we know about AKHi TV is that AKHi TV, once again, I'm not sure if he's just heavily delusional or he has a narrative that he tries to play out. But of course, AKHi TV and Dante's Boxing Nation, those two especially, who have very, very similar personalities, they're very well known for being very hypocritical, and on top of that, having double standards and really not making any sense whatsoever. So basically, what that means is whatever energy they may have with one fighter, at least when it comes to certain fighters that are not Black American fighters, like a Canelo Alvarez or a Vasyl Lomachenko, or certain fighters that they don't like, they're going to throw those fighters under the bus, or a Tyson Fury or Alexander Usyk. They're not going to treat those fighters the same as they would, say, a Terence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. or a Deontay Wilder, certain fighters that they tend to like. So it just is what it is. But anyways, AKHi TV, he's going to talk about Terence Bud Crawford. He's going to talk about the possibility of there being an Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Crawford fight. And seeing where it goes, I may review another video for this video. I may not. We'll see what happens. But let's get into it. Let's see what he has to say.
Down, put his hand to his face and said, I'm out of here. Well, if you expected Errol Spence to hop in the ring last night, then you was highly mistaken. Because Errol Spence sure disappeared like magic when Terence Crawford knocked out Sean Porter.
Let me give AKHi TV some credit there. At least he is somewhat a legend because Dante's Boxing Nation, he has not taken that step yet. Once again, Dante, he basically tries to allege that Canelo is not number 1 pound for pound because he is allegedly ducking certain people. At least that's what he tries to say. So he can't go as far to say that with Errol Spence Jr. because he wants to allege that Terence Crawford is the number 1 pound for pound. But just in case Errol Spence beats Terence Crawford, he can't necessarily say all in all 100% that Errol Spence is ducking Terence Crawford. Otherwise, that would put him below Canelo Alvarez, and he can't have that. So that's why Dante, he has not been really alleging, at least 100% for certain, that Errol Spence is ducking Terence Crawford. He may hint at it here and there, but he's never going to come out and say it 100% like he would with a Canelo Alvarez or another fighter that he may not like. So it is what it is. Anyway.
Now, leading up to this fight.
Now, if you ask me, do I believe that Errol Spence is ducking Terence Crawford? We'll have to see. Once again, I've never been a big supporter of the narrative that Errol Spence has been ducking Terence Crawford because, once again, it was Terence Crawford's decision at the end of the day to not sign with the PBC and go over to Top Rank and re-sign with them when none of the other big boy welterweights or big money names were over there with Top Rank. So Terence Crawford really, in my opinion, has no one else to blame but himself.
Hey, I told you guys, if Terence Crawford could stop Sean Porter, which is something no one has been able to do, or came even close to doing, then that would directly apply a lot of pressure on Errol Spence to fight Terence Crawford, since Errol Spence had a very close classic fight with Sean Porter. Now, at this point, Terence...
Well, let me say this, because certain people who support Terence Crawford, and I've had certain Crawford fanboys, on my channel, they think that that I'm some big hater of him, and trust me, I'm not. I like Terence. Terence is one of my favorite fighters to watch, and I do hope all in all that, he does give Errol Spence Jr. a very tough fight if he does not even beat Errol Spence, because Terence, he really is one of my favorite fighters to watch. But just being logical and just being objective, I do have to rank Errol Spence Jr. as the number one welterweight in the world right now, just based off of his resume. Once again, certain people, they'll say, oh, well, how can you say that? Terence just knocked out Sean Porter. Errol Spence was not able to do that. That's true. So I give Terence Crawford a little bit more credit against Sean Porter than I would in Errol Spence Jr. But at the end of the day, Errol Spence was able to beat Sean Porter when he was a champion and when he was coming off of a win over Danny Garcia. So it just is what it is. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, Errol Spence was also able to beat Danny Garcia. He was also able to beat Mikey when he was undefeated and an A-grade fighter. He was able to defeat Kell Brook when he was the IBF champion of the welterweight division. So I'm sorry, but there just really is no debate. Although Terence Crawford's resume now is certainly much better with that Sean Porter win, especially after stopping him, I still have to put Errol Spence's resume a little bit above Terence Crawford's, just in terms of the amount of A-class fighters that he has fought when they were at their best. Now, Sean Porter, in my opinion, he was at his best yesterday when he fought Terence Crawford. But when he fought Kell Brook was pretty much mincemeat. And I know a lot of people, they're not going to like that, but it is what it is. That's just the bottom line.
Crawford has a better resume.
And just talking about the Sean Porter fight, a lot of people like to say, oh, well, a very tough fight. People try to act like that was a rightful split decision. Now, it did end up being a split decision at the end of the day, but I thought that was a very poor scorecard. Because Errol Spence Jr., every single time that I've watched that fight, I don't know how the hell they scored it for Sean Porter. I mean, I thought Errol Spence won clearly 8 rounds to 4 each and every time that I saw it. And Errol Spence was able to knock down Sean Porter too.
Then Errol Spence at welterweight. I'm not even talking about overall. Terence Crawford becoming undisputed at 140 and being a 3-division world champion. But have now beat more names at welterweight. In fact, Errol Spence's best names and wins on his resume are against Kell Brook and Sean Porter. Both gave Errol Spence
Right, but AKHi, don't play that game. Let's not try to be... Once again, I don't know if AKHi is just delusional, and I think that he might be, because with the way that he talks, I do think that he truly believes some of this stuff. I don't think he's as dumb overall as he, gives off, but I do think that, he still is not overtly intelligent. But it is what it is. Let's not play that game, because, Kell Brook, when he was defeated by Errol Spence Jr., that was a 50-50 fight. And people, all in all, they knew that Kell Brook, yeah, he got knocked out by Golovkin, but that was the last bit of greatness that he had. Kell Brook, at the time, was the IBF champion. And when Sean Porter, fought Errol Spence Jr., he was the WBC champion coming off of a win over Danny Garcia. So if you're trying to argue, all in all, that Terence Crawford and Errol Spence, they have the same resume at welterweight. No, sir. No, they don't.
Decent challenge.
That's why Errol Spence Jr. has more belts at the welterweight division than Terence Bud Crawford.
We all witnessed what boxing pound-for-pound #1 Terence Crawford did to Sean and Kell Brook. Bud violated them into retirement. For 6 years now, Terence Crawford have been stopping everyone. Undefeated fighters too. Jeff Horn, who beat Man...
Right, but who are these undefeated fighters? Now, this is the same guy, all in all, that says that apparently Caleb Plant and Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders and, Danny Jacobs, all these guys, and some of them are not undefeated, but, he basically says that all these guys are bums, or Canelo, picks his fights. And I'm not saying that Canelo may not pick his fights here and there once again. But Canelo, on the average occasion, is usually facing some sort of A-grade fighter. All those guys that I just mentioned, in my opinion, were A-grade champions, and Canelo beat them when they were champions. If AKHi TV is really trying to compare the resume of Terence Crawford to Canelo Alvarez or someone else by saying, oh, well, Terence, he defeated some undefeated fighters. I mean, let's be real. You defeated Aegis Kavalaskas, Jeff Horn, Jose Benavidez. None of those guys are A-grade fighters. I'm sorry, none of them.
Pac-Man Pacquiao. Errol Spence wanted to unify with him. We all witnessed how Crawford washed him. Benavidez, who was a former champion, Mean Machine, an Olympian.
Benavidez was a former champion. Benavidez was an interim champion, I believe, at the 140-pound weight division. I don't count that as a real champion, and some people, they're going to get mad at that. I don't count that as a real champion. You know, when Floyd Mayweather was fighting elite names, he was not facing usually interim champions. He was usually facing the super weight champions, or he was facing the ones that held the actual belt, or eventually later on got promoted to it. Ain't no damn interim champion. Come on. Jose Benavidez was a real champion. That's the same dude that a lot of people lost. Everyone thought actually lost to Mauricio Herrera in that one fight. But Mauricio Herrera, like regular, ended up getting jobbed in that fight or screwed over.
And Kell Brook and Sean Porter, which by doing so, Terence Crawford stamped.
And once again, isn't that so interesting how he gives him full credit for defeating Kell Brook and Sean Porter? And I give you 100% credit for defeating Sean Porter because I think that he was at a decent point in his career. But when Canelo or Vasily Lomachenko, when they used to fight fighters, you know, that maybe even had just one loss in their career or were even undefeated, like a Guillermo Rigondeaux, what would he say? He would say that, oh, Guillermo Rigondeaux, you know, he was coming off of a layoff. Or, you know, when it comes to someone else, oh, those are just Mikey Garcia leftovers. Well, why was Kell Brook not Errol Spence Jr.'s leftovers? And let's be real, that's all he was. It is what it is. Now, Sean Porter, you can say that he's Errol Spence Jr. leftovers, but at least Sean Porter was at a good point in his career. So I give Terence Crawford credit for that, but let's not try to act like Terence Crawford has this A+ resume over everyone else. I mean, let's be real. This was a great win, but you're damn near 40 fights into your career, and now the biggest win of your career, hands down, is over a dude that was never looked at as the best in the welterweight division. What does that really say about your resume?
That he the best welterweight in the world. More importantly, the #1 pound for pound.
Well, I think all in all that he's the best welterweight in the world in terms of skills. But I have to see him beat Errol Spence Jr. first for him to definitively prove that. We can all, once again, like I said, we can talk shit all day and say these things, but until I see you beat Errol Spence Jr., I cannot rank you above him. I just can't.
King in the sport of boxing. And one of the hardest punchers pound for pound. He is truly the man to beat. Meanwhile, some ways...
I agree with that. I think that Terence Crawford, all in all, certainly has great power. And you know what? That's actually going to give me a little bit to talk about this. You guys remember with the narratives that these idiots were claiming when Tyson Fury allegedly cheated against Deontay Wilder? Remember that stupid-ass narrative that they were trying to come up with? And then they were proved wrong in the third match where Deontay Wilder got his ass handed to him in a very similar fashion like he did in the rematch. You know, this is the bottom line. What they are always trying to allege is that, oh, well, how come Tyson Fury had this power out of nowhere in the second match? It's not that he had this power out of nowhere. Tyson Fury has always had decent power, at least somewhat a decent punching power, and he was able to hit Deontay Wilder more often than usual than his other opponents because Tyson Fury, he's just a more skilled boxer than Deontay Wilder was ever used to facing. It just is what it is. Now I take a look at Terence Crawford here, and if I wanted to spread that same narrative, if I wanted to be like AKHi or Dante's Boxing Nation here, I could sit here and say, oh, well, you know what? How does Terence Crawford have so much power to stop Sean Porter? A guy that has never been stopped before, even against Keith Thurman and Errol Spence Jr. and Adrian Broner and Danny Garcia, but all of a sudden Terence Crawford knocks him out and, you know, he's moving up the weight divisions and he's gaining more power and he's not gaining any fat or flab or anything like that. You know, I think Terence Crawford is on steroids. Now, who knows? Is that possible? Who knows? But if you know anything about boxing, you've seen within history that certain fighters, whether they move up in certain weight divisions or even if they fight in certain fights, you know, well, one day they may not appear to have A-grade power, or I'm not saying that, you know, they don't appear to have A-grade power, but they may not always knock out a person that is, you know, someone who's a B or C grade fighter, and then against an A-grade fighter, who knows, they may knock him out. Like Andre Ward, for example. Andre Ward didn't knock out every single, you know, elite opponent that he had, but he knocked out Sergey Kovalev, who was the best opponent in his career. It just happens like that sometimes, and Terence Crawford, he put on the performance of his life against Sean Porter, and he prepared very well, and he turned it up to another gear. And that's why, all in all, if you know anything about boxing, it just happens like that sometimes. Certain people, when they move up the weight divisions, sometimes they'll get even more knockouts because the power is able to transfer with them. Not every fighter is like that, but some fighters are. Terence Crawford is one of those guys.
Somehow he's the boogeyman. And if you're wondering, how the heck is that possible? Well, last night was a perfect example. Why do you think Errol Spence rolled out of the arena, then into the ring? Everyone knows this man Bud is the truth. It's like a hidden secret. However, with this performance, they cannot keep it a secret anymore. Furthermore, let's get to Errol Spence's reaction.
Well, Terence Crawford proved all in all that, he certainly is a definitive A-grade fighter. And certain people may say, what are you talking about? He was a definitive A-grade fighter before. I would somewhat agree, but once again, this was going to be the difference between being, say, one of the top, 2 pound-for-pound fighters in the world, or at least a little bit later on, and possibly being just, another Sean Porter type of fighter or Danny Garcia. I think Terence always would have been an A-grade fighter, but there's a difference between being possibly the best in the welterweight division and, say, being on the Sean Porter or Danny Garcia level. What Terence Crawford showed me yesterday is that he is pretty much on that Errol Spence Jr. level, at least in terms of skills, but I do still need to see a couple of bigger wins. I would like to see him face Keith Thurman or Errol Spence, of course, is the fight that everyone wants to see. If he can get his hands on Ugas, that would be a great fight as well, because, of course, I believe Ugas has the WBA belt. Unfortunately, I don't think that Crawford is going to be able to get to him before Spence, but we'll see. We'll see.
To Terence Crawford knocking out Sean Porter. He stated, quote, "If I was Sean, I wouldn't pay my dad." Laugh out loud. Now, first of all, I know everyone wanted to see Marvelous, a war. However, the reality is, Kenny Porter saved his son from becoming a meme. That's right.
I agree with that as well. Well, Sean Porter, with the way that he was getting his ass whooped in those last 3 rounds, he might already become a meme anyway. Especially with the way that he slammed his hand on the ground, those last 3, times. Or, 3 times when he was knocked down. But, hey, it is what it is. We're all frustrated, when that happens. I get it. It's whatever. It's emotional during a fight. But, when it comes down to it, all in all, like I said, very impressive performance by Terence Crawford. Especially the way that he was able to close it.
Kenny Porter.
Now, let me also talk about this because one of my watchers commented earlier on one of the videos. I believe that I released it yesterday, or it may have been today. I can't really remember. But I think maybe it was earlier today, where we were talking about Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford. And I said that if Terence Crawford, because of course a lot of people after this are going to be alleging that he now for sure is the number 1 pound for pound. And I said that, well, I can't necessarily allege that yet because you beat Sean Porter, which is a great win. That's an A-grade win, don't get me wrong. But that would be like Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, beating someone like a Jermell Charlo. And me saying like, wow, he clearly is the number 1 pound for pound fighter, just because of that win. And that would be the best win on his resume. Like, I'm sorry, I just can't do that. Because Canelo, at the end of the day, he has wins over people like Sonny Lara. Now, of course, that was a bit controversial, but at the end of the day, he got it. It is what it is. He beat Golovkin, in my opinion, in that rematch. And, of course, he just beat the shit out of Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant and Callum Smith. All, in my opinion, A-grade fighters. Very decent fighters. All brought something to the table, in my opinion, that were a challenge. They all were champions. Legitimate champions, not interim bullshit champions when it comes down to it. One of them being a Ring Magazine champion in Callum Smith. Canelo is defeating real deal champions. Whether you think that they're on the same level as Jermall Charlo or David Benavidez, or, a Demetrius Andrade, that's up to you. In my opinion, they're on a very similar level. But there is no doubt about it in my mind. Canelo, as of recent, has fought usually way better competition than Terence Crawford has. It just is what it is. But at the end of the day, if Terence wants to be remembered or wants to be ranked as the definitive number 1 pound for pound fighter in the world of boxing, you have to go after that one person, Errol Spence Jr. And that's why when I heard rumors of allegedly, Terence Crawford apparently not wanting the Errol Spence Jr. fight, Terence, if you're not going to be ranked as the number 1 pound for pound fighter because you don't face Errol Spence Jr., you have no one else to blame but yourself why you are not ranked as the number 1 pound for pound fighter, or at least not in that discussion.
Did the right thing. He saved his son from becoming a meme, since he knew exactly what was coming. More importantly, he saved Sean Porter for his health. It ain't no secret. Terence Crawford.
And Sean Porter apparently retired, and I think that was a very good decision because I think Sean Porter, after this, he realizes that there's just nothing left to do. And Sean Porter apparently said that, I'm not going to be a gatekeeper for a lot of these guys. Well, I hate to tell Sean this, and I'm not trying to be rude or anything like that. Sean, even at his best, was pretty much known as a gatekeeper. And this is why I said Sean Porter, he's what we call an A-grade gatekeeper. That does not mean that you're a bad fighter. That does not mean all in all that you're not a great fighter. It just means all in all that you cannot be remembered on the same level as, say, like during the Floyd Mayweather Jr. era versus Manny Pacquiao era. There were certain fighters, all in all, that they were A-grade gatekeepers. They could not be on the same level as the Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather Jr. Certain fighters within those divisions, like Miguel Cotto. Now, I don't know if I want to necessarily 100% call Miguel Cotto an A-grade keeper, but in a way, that's kind of what he was. Because Miguel Cotto, I'm not going to say that in every division he lost to the guy that, was the best. So that's why Miguel Cotto, in my opinion, is on a whole nother level compared to Sean, because maybe there was a couple of times at one point in time that you could have called Miguel Cotto the best in certain weight divisions, depending on what you count. But when it comes down to it, all in all, Miguel Cotto was never going to be looked at as on the Mayweather or the Manny Pacquiao level. But what Cotto could be looked at is on the Shane Mosley level. Maybe on the, I'm trying to think, the level of maybe, say, a couple of the other champions overall out there. Fighters that, would get great wins here and there, but, some of the bigger fights also as well, they would lose, especially when they would face the creme de la creme. And when I talk about the creme de la creme, I'm not talking about fighters that were just A grade. I'm talking about fighters that could have debatably been the number one pound for pound fighter. That's kind of what Miguel Cotto was. That's kind of what Sean Porter is to a degree, except a lesser version.
Is one of the hardest punchers. More importantly, he's the best finisher in the game. He has that.
One of them, certainly.
A killer instinct in him. More importantly, Crawford never forgets to go to the body whenever he has his opponents hurt. That's rare for a fighter to do. They all go head hunting.
I agree, and a certain amount of people may ask this question, and they may say, well, do you think that Terence Crawford has more power than that of an Errol Spence Jr.? Is that why he stopped him? I'm not going to go as far to say that Terence Crawford, in my opinion, has more power than Errol Spence Jr. Now, who knows? He may go up a weight division, or he may face Danny Garcia. He may knock him out within a certain amount of rounds, and then I may say, you know what? Maybe after a while, I do have to say Terence Crawford has more power than Errol Spence Jr. But there's certain fighters that they're able to knock out fighters, not necessarily because they have more power than another fighter per se, but they're able to knock him out because they just have better counter-punching ability, and they fight more intelligently, and they have better punch placement. And on top of that, they also know how to go to the body evenly. Now, Errol Spence Jr., I think that he can do all those things to a great degree, but Terence Crawford, in almost every single one of those categories, in my opinion, does it better than that of an Errol Spence Jr. And just talking about the Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence fight, once again, I had one of my commenters basically say that, well, if Terence Crawford beats Errol Spence, you're saying that that's a bigger win than if Canelo beats Dimitri Bivol or Archer Beterbiev. Is that what you're saying? Well, I understand your mindset if you were to say that, beating Archer Beterbiev or Dimitri Bivol would be greater, but it's sort of on the same lines. The difference is that Terence Crawford, if you were able to beat Errol Spence Jr., I think as of right now, he may be the favorite, but I could see Errol Spence being the favorite as well. Either way, I think it's going to be, whoever's going to be the favorite. Probably going to be about a 2-1 favorite. So that's about a 50-50 fight. It's a coin toss for a lot of people. Right now, in my opinion, I would favor Terence Crawford. Canelo Alvarez, he would probably be the favorite over Dimitri Bivol or Archer Beterbiev. But of course, the difference there is that Canelo Alvarez is out of his element in light heavyweight. So it may be on a very, very similar level. But Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, is a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. So to answer that person's question, as I had, responded in the comment section, yes, if Terence Crawford defeats Errol Spence Jr., especially dominantly or without controversy, he certainly has to be, even with controversy, he certainly has to be in the category of possibly being the number one pound-for-pound fighter. So it is what it is, but I cannot put you in that category until that happens.
Whenever they hurt their opponent. However, Bud is an exception. I remember leading up to this fight, Terence Crawford took major shots at Errol Spence by making fun of Errol Spence.
And the reason why that is, let me explain this once again. because Canelo beat Gennady Golovkin when Gennady Golovkin was a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. And I think that you can maybe someone argue that a peak Gennady Golovkin is just as dangerous, if not even more, than a peak Errol Spence Jr. Whatever you want to argue.
For not finishing Sean when he dropped him in the 10th round. Buzz stated if that was me, I would have finished him. And man, wasn't he telling the truth? Another thing, Errol Spence stated that Sean Porter was winning the fight. Now, obviously, that's what he's supposed to say. But I sure...
Yes, I certainly don't believe Sean Porter was winning the fight. I think Sean Porter was giving him a great fight. But I can't say all in all that he was winning the fight. I certainly can't say that. Errol Spence Jr. looked a little bit pissed off and aggravated, to be honest with you, that Terence Crawford won that fight. I think that he was hoping that Sean Porter was going to give him a little bit more problems than what he did. Once again, I'm not going to go on the narrative and spread things and say Errol Spence Jr. is ducking Terence Crawford, but you can tell when a fighter realizes that, this is going to be a very hard matchup for me. If Errol Spence is going to defeat Terence Crawford, once again, he's going to have to go to hell and back.
Didn't see Errol Spence hop in the ring after the fight, though. More importantly, Sean Porter was not winning the fight. After the 5th round,
I agree with you, Aki. It seems like it takes your favorite fighters to box for you to actually have some common sense and pull your head out of your own ass.
Terence Crawford completely took over and separated himself from Sean Porter. He completely elevated his game.
I agree. What I'll say on he's got Goku here. Oh man. Anyway, when it comes down to it, but like I said, all in all, just to talk about my scorecard personally, because I look at myself as a logical and objective scorecard keeper. All in all, I'm usually very non-biased. I think within the first 6 rounds, I had it 3-3, but at about that 7th, 8th round, especially, Terence was really starting to pull away. And I noticed that Sean Porter, that he was more exhausted than usual. And he ends up getting a little bit tired. But with Terence Crawford, his gas tank is just, it's really almost unlimited. There's certain fighters out there that their gas tank is just, there's no end to it. There's certain fighters overall, whether you see in UFC or UFC, MMA, whatever you want to call it, or boxing, that you take a look at their gas tank and there's just no limit. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was one of those fighters. Terence Crawford is one of those fighters. Vasily Lomachenko is one of those fighters. Rocky Marciano was one of those fighters. Joe Calzaghe had an excellent gas tank as well. I'm trying to think overall who else. I would have to watch Roy Jones Jr. a little bit more. I don't think I ever remember him getting tired though. There's certain fighters like that just, they have unlimited gas. Khabib Nurmagomedov was another one of those fighters as well. Now, of course, he was UFC. But when you take a look at some of the exercises that Terence Crawford does, especially in his workouts, like he runs up certain mountains or large hills with certain elevation, like in Colorado. Of course, he lives in Omaha, Nebraska, so Colorado, not too far away from Nebraska, when it comes down to it. So, Terence Crawford, he, his gas tank, he is really, really very physically gifted. Terence is really one of the best athletes in the world, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. His gas tank, I thought maybe we'd see some slight holes in it, and I think here and there he looked a little bit tired. But when he got that second wind, there was no going away. His gas tank really, really showed up.
Just like Goku. Or let's not say Goku, because Bud is too serious to be Goku. More so like Vegeta. Terence Crawford, Ray...
Isn't Vegeta the second most powerful guy compared to Goku? I wouldn't know because I was never a huge Dragon Ball Z watcher, but I don't know. The most powerful people that I remember, at least with the episodes that I watch, of course, Goku, Vegeta, Frieza, that one cat guy, I can't even remember his name, but, wouldn't that kind of mean that Terence Crawford is the second best compared to Errol Spence?
His power level up as the fight continued. By the 9th round, Terence Crawford transformed to a destruction Super Saiyan level. Yeah, you could say the fight was competitive early, but by the time of the stoppage, Terence Crawford was clearly up on the scorecard, as all of
I agree with that.
the judges had Terence Crawford winning. Nevertheless, that don't even matter because Terence Crawford did something Errol Spence couldn't do, which is stop Sean Porter, knocking him down twice back-to-back in the meantime.
And I had never seen Sean Porter knocked down twice in a round. The first knockdown, I was like, okay, you know what, Sean Porter, you kind of lunged in and, he ran into a left uppercut, I believe it was. Terence Crawford, he says that he's a switch hitter, but you can tell he's just so much better in the southpaw stance. It just is what it is. And there's certain fighters like that where they may be naturally a right-hander, but they fight in southpaw, or they may be naturally a left-hander and they fight orthodox, like Miguel Cotto and Andre Ward. They're naturally two southpaws, I believe, and they fight orthodox, partially because they want their jab to be better and they have a little bit more power in that left hand. Like Miguel Cotto, not only was Miguel Cotto one of the hardest hitters in history, but his left hook was, it was fatal. If you got hit flushly by, that Miguel Cotto left hook, it was going to hurt like hell.
Will step back to create space and have Sean Porter lunging, catching.
And Terence has, I'm not, I don't know if I would go as far to say one-shot knockout power with both hands. I'm not going to necessarily put it on that level because I think that certain punches like that, I would have to say that would probably be someone like a Artur Beterbiev or a Gervonta Tank Davis or a Gennady Golovkin. And I don't think Terence Crawford is necessarily on that level per se. And I can't say that his power, at least for his division, is on the same level as like a prime Roy Jones Jr. But maybe what I would compare it to is maybe something like a Sugar Ray Leonard. Something like that, to where he certainly can knock you out. He can hurt you, no doubt about it.
Him with a major counter every single time. That's why Kenny saved Sean Porter. Because once Crawford started to connect with the counter haymakers he was throwing, Kenny knew it was only a matter of time. So again, he saved his son from becoming a meme. I would have did the same thing. Now where Kenny messed up is when he threw his son Sean Porter under the bus. But that's my next video. For now, the $1 million question. Is Errol Spence going to stop?
And for those of you all in all that don't know what AKHi TV is talking about, apparently Kenny Porter, he said that, he did not think that Sean Porter trained the way all in all that, he wanted to. Now, certain people, I'm not sure if he was necessarily talking about that Sean Porter did not train the way that he wanted him to in practice, or maybe if he was just saying that in that moment or just for the fight, I don't know. But, Kenny Porter, of course, has always been hard on Sean. Sean tried, and there were certain people that I've seen in the comment section of this video, they said, oh, well, Sean Porter gave Terence Crawford too much respect. Listen, man, it's easy to say that when you're sitting on the couch and not boxing the guy. Listen, Terence Crawford, man, he is an A-grade puncher. I'm not going to say that he's an A-plus puncher, but he at least has A- or A power. I would say he has good A power, because you can't knock out a guy that has never been knocked out before, who has a very decent chin in Sean Porter, and not have at least A-grade power. So it is what it is.
Avoiding Terence Crawford, like the rest of the welterweight division. Well, the positive sign is that Errol Spence retweeted PBC on Fox poster of Errol versus Crawford fight next. Now, the negative sign is Errol Spence didn't sound so optimistic during the post-fight reaction to the Terence versus Sean Porter fight, which is what
I would agree with that.
Terence Crawford was afraid of. He stated that he wanted to save Sean Porter for last, since he knew they can always fight. He also obviously wanted the winner of the Errol versus Porter fight, then the loser. However, one thing Bud stated that he was afraid of is that his performance may push the welterweight division away even further from him after they see how he violates.
Well, as long as Terence Crawford does not re-sign with Top Rank, it is going to be at least a certain amount harder for a lot of these other welterweights to avoid him. And now I think a certain amount of them are at least going to look at Terence Crawford and say, okay, it's actually worth it more now that Terence Crawford, now that not only he has a belt, but of course he's had a belt in that division for a while, but, of course he has a belt still. And on top of that, he finally gets beat a big name. And I'm betting you, I don't know how many buys this pay-per-view did. I doubt that it probably did 1 million, because to do 1 million, you have to be a very, very huge attraction, almost on the Canelo Alvarez level. But I would not be surprised if this did around 500 to 600,000 to possibly even 800,000 pay-per-view buys. Would not be surprised at all.
Sean Porter. That remains to be seen. For the meantime, Errol Spence, he's aggressively pushing for a unification with Ugas. But since Ugas is stuck in this tournament with the WBA hot mess they got going on, Errol could fight Terence Crawford for the meantime. This is the biggest and best fight in boxing that can be made right now. Obviously, Errol Spence stated that he will never go to Terence Crawford fight. but ironically, he did, which is a good sign. How can you not show up to an event of boxing pound for pound #1, especially when he's in your division? Now, as we speak, there is no other side of the street excuse anymore. Terence Crawford is.
Well, like I said, we can say that, but Terence Crawford, I really hope that he does not re-sign with Top Rank. Because I don't think Bob Arum is what's best for you, and on top of that, none of the other elite welterweights are over there with Top Rank anyway. I'm really hoping he signs with the PBC, but who the hell knows?
A free agent. So there is no more excuses to be made. It's put up or shut up at this point in time. Last but not least, to all of the people that was downplaying Terence Crawford accomplishments, even though you guys were the same ones claiming Crawford was ducking Postal. But when he fought him, he's a nobody. He was ducking Flex Diaz. Then when he knocked him out, he's a nobody. Then.
Well, I agree with that. There are a certain amount of people I know that were playing that little game with Terence Crawford. I agree with you. But let's also be real, because I never was one of those people. I'm not someone that just alleges that someone is ducking someone unless I have a clear amount of evidence. Because I'm not a person that thinks super duper emotionally, especially when it comes to sports or things that I like to break down or things that I have to analyze. So it is what it is. You know, I was never a big supporter of those narratives. But let's also be real. Victor Postal and Felix Diaz, they're good fighters, but they're not great fighters. None of those fighters are on the same level as a Sean Porter. And Sean Porter to this day is hands down the biggest win in Terence Crawford's career. Terence is still going to have to prove himself. He proved that he was able to get past Sean Porter, but you're also probably going to have to get fights against Danny Swift Garcia, Keith Thurman, Errol Spence Jr. especially, and possibly even Yordenis Ugas. Those are the fighters that you're going to have to face. And if you go up to 154, you could certainly face a Jamel Charlo. I would actually be more interested in a Brian Castano fight, because I think Brian Castano, I think that he's a more interesting fight for Terence. Because Castano, he's very powerful. I've seen him hurt Jamel Charlo multiple times. He's a very good pressure fighter. And I think all in all, actually, Brian Castano, whether he wins the rematch against Jamel Charlo or not, I actually think that he's a little bit more talented and skilled than what a Jamel Charlo would be. That would be a very interesting fight.
It was the same thing with Jeff Horn and Benavidez. The same.
Like, if Terence was able to go up and defeat Brian Castano, I wouldn't say that that would be on the same level as Canelo beating, say, like a Artur Beterbiev. But I would say maybe you could argue that maybe it could be on the level of, say, Canelo beating, like, maybe a Dimitri Bivol. Maybe. I don't even know if I want to 100% compare it to that, but, you know, maybe it would be somewhere around there.
Thing with Kell Brook and Sean Porter. Now, what do you guys have to say? How ironic is it that Terence Crawford is the first one to become undisputed in like 13 years, when he accomplished that beating better competition than Canelo did at 168? They told Bud Lomachenko, who was 8-1 at the time.
I don't understand this narrative. I don't know how people can buy into this narrative of Terence Crawford somehow is beating better competition at 140 than what Canelo did at 168. And I knew that they were going to try to ride with that narrative, because one of the bullshit narratives they always try to put out there about how Terence is allegedly #1 pound for pound over Canelo is because he unified a division. And of course, as soon as Canelo did it, all of a sudden he's facing nobodies. Well, they've been saying that he's been facing nobodies for a while, but just to detract him more, they said that he unified against complete nobodies. I don't give a shit what anyone says. Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, Caleb Plant, way more talented than any of the fighters Terence ever fought at 140. That's not really even a debate. Is Victor Postal more talented than a Callum Smith? Is he more talented than a Billy Joe Saunders? Is he more talented than all in all a Caleb Plant? He's not more talented than any of those fighters. Just stop.
Is better than you. Then with that same breath, the moment Canelo became undisputed in the weakest division in boxing, ducking the best competition from Charlo Andrade and David Benavidez, they turned around and called Canelo the greatest. See, the difference between Crawford and Canelo is that Crawford,
the alleged overall weakest division in boxing, when Terence Crawford unified the 140-pound division, do you know who he beat? He beat Victor Postal, who, like I said, in my opinion, never was an A-grade fighter. It just is what it is. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, he beat Thomas Delorme, who actually never even held a title, I believe, and I'm talking about one of the official titles, or a super title. He never held one of those. I don't even know if he held an interim title, for Christ's sake. And on top of that, that was for a vacant title. I believe that was for the WBA title. And then he fought Joyous Ndango. I mean, come on. Is Joyous Ndango above a lot of the names on Terence Crawford's list? No. Come on. Or on Canelo's list? No.
Doesn't vacate his title just because he has a deadly mandatory in Sean Porter, like Canelo did with Charlo, and is doing today with David Benavidez. And the biggest difference, Terence Crawford is constantly pushing to make the biggest and best fights for the fans, with Errol Spence, Keith Thurman, Manny Pacquiao, etc., etc.
Well, you say that, but then the fights have never happened. Now, of course, people will say that, oh, that's because Terence Crawford is being avoided. How are you being avoided when you repeatedly sign with Top Rank, a promotion company that has none of the other big boy and welterweights over there? So it is what it is. Once again, don't talk to me about this, oh, Terence, he's always fighting the best. No, he's not. Once again, this Sean Porter win, I give him a hell of a lot of credit. That is hands down, to this point, the biggest win in his career.
Center. The only problem, they ducking him, so he couldn't secure those fights. If it was up to him, Crawford would have already fought all of them guys, including the guys at 154. On the other hand, Canelo can fight anybody. However, he chooses to fight the weakest bodies. Avini, Rocky Fielding, Maccabi, even though he could secure...
Avini, yes, Avini overall, Avni Yildirim, whatever the hell his name is. Obviously, that dude was a C-class fighter. Rocky Fielding was not an elite fighter either. But for every guys that he fights like that, he gets a Caleb Plant, who in my opinion is an A-grade fighter, at least an A- fighter. He gets a Callum Smith, who in my opinion was an A-grade fighter and the Ring Magazine champion. He fights a Billy Joe Saunders, who is very talented. Now, whether you believe that David Benavidez, Andre, or Charlo is more talented than those guys, that's up to you. In my personal opinion, they're pretty much on the similar level. But it is what it is.
For the biggest money and legacy fights the whole world wants to see against David Benavidez, Charlo, and Andre. That's why Terence Crawford, without...
A lot of you people all know that, may remember it. They used to say that Canelo Alvarez needed to face Billy Joe Saunders. Because Billy Joe Saunders, remember, Canelo used to say that he did not like Billy Joe Saunders' style. But then eventually he fought Billy Joe Saunders, and then after he beat Billy Joe Saunders, what did they say? Oh, well, Billy Joe Saunders, he wasn't anything. Why don't you fight Andre? Why don't you fight these other guys? And those fights still need to happen, in my opinion, don't get me wrong. But that just goes to show you that AKHi TV and Dante's Boxing Nation, they'll use any name that they have to in order to try and degrade Canelo Alvarez.
Not a question, is boxing pound for pound number one. He did not need PEDs to get the job done. He did it through hard work and dedication, blood, sweat, and tears. Being the best pound for pound means you move up in divisions and beat the best fighters available, which is what Crawford is doing, to a T. Being pound for pound...
Well, I agree to a degree, all in all, when it comes down to if you want to say that being pound for pound is moving up weight divisions and beating the best there, but let's be real. The only best fighter that he's ever beat at welterweight was Sean Porter. And Sean Porter is not the top dog there.
Is not move up in weight and pick on the weakest competition. Cherry pick the weakest opponents. That's not what being pound for pound...
Yes, but you had no problem with Terence Crawford allegedly facing Patrick Teixeira, who clearly was the weakest one at 154 at the time. So let's be real here, AKHi. It is what it is.
And that's exactly what Canelo Alvarez does.
And I understand a certain amount of people, they're going to say that, well, Lunga Makabu, he is the weakest link overall at 200 pounds. Of course, in my opinion, or at least debatably. But Makabu, when it comes down to, like I said, he has a couple of wins over some high prospects in that division at least. And when it comes down to it, Makabu, all in all, is at least the official WBC champion. Do I think that Makabu is an A-grade fighter? No, I do not. But Canelo is outweighed at least by 2 natural weight divisions. That's why I compare it to a Roy Jones Jr. versus John Ruiz. And I had a debate the other day on a Facebook poll, and some of the people all in all were saying, oh, well, John Ruiz beat Evander Holyfield. Can you say that Makabu beat any great fighters? I'm not saying that Makabu beat any all-time great fighters. But this fight is on a similar playing field, and there's going to be a certain amount of people that say, oh, you can't even compare it to that because John Ruiz, he beat someone like a Roy Jones, or excuse me, he beat someone like an Evander Holyfield. He beat Evander Holyfield, but Evander at that point in time, I'm not saying that he did not have a little bit of goodness left in his career, but Evander was pretty much done. I mean, you know, he was 39 years old at that point, and he was just coming off of 2 ass whoopings pretty much against Lennox Lewis. So, I mean, come on. Am I really supposed to believe that that was the best version of Evander Holyfield? Do we really think that John Ruiz 100% beats a prime Evander Holyfield? I mean, come on here. It just is what it is. What are we really talking about? That's why, you know, now if you want to argue that John Ruiz is a greater fighter or is an all-around better fighter than Ilunga Makabu, I don't really have a problem with that. But all I'm saying is that I don't really have a problem with the Canelo Alvarez-Ilunga fight because it's somewhere along those lines. Just like Roy Jones Jr. picked on the weakest link to get his heavyweight title, but although it was still an interesting matchup because he was clearly outweighed, it's the same thing that Canelo Alvarez is doing with the cruiserweight division. But to me, it's somewhat acceptable because at least Canelo is outweighed by good natural two-weight divisions. Because Canelo, like I said, he's on that level to where, kind of like Roy Jones Jr., wherever he goes, he's going to be favored.
To a T. That's why he's the European assassin. Europe.
But like I said, after that fight against Ilunga, Canelo is going to have to face an A-grade fighter or he is going to get a hell of a lot of criticism. And he'll deserve to. So Canelo is going to have to face an A-grade fighter after that, whether it be Dimitri Bivol or Artur Beterbiev or Jamal Charlo or whoever it may be, David Benavidez, Demetrius Andrade. You're going to have to face one of those fighters, in my opinion. In my opinion, it is what it is.
Pound for pound #1. The #1 cherry-picking king of all time, Canelo Alvarez. However, what he got Bud beat in is that he has the complexion for the connection. With the facts being laid out, dropping...
What he has Bud beat in is almost everything. And a certain amount of people ain't going to like that, but it is what it is. He has a majorly beaten resume. It's really not even close. When you talk about the amount of champions that he's beat, he hasn't beaten that. Even when you talk about skill set, he may even possibly haven't beaten that. And that's saying a lot because Terence, in my opinion, you could debate him debatably as the most talented fighter in the world, but I may even put Canelo a little bit over Terence Bud Crawford.
Your thoughts in the comment section below, subscribe below, and click on the notification bell to be continued on the next episode of AKHi TV. Peace, and I'm on to the next one. A couple months ago, he said, what he say? It's gonna happen.
But anyways, that's really about it for today. I'm not going to review the fan video because I think all in all that I pretty much unexpectedly giving or got everything in this video that I needed to. So that's really about it for today. But thank you all so much for watching. We'll see what happens with Terence Bud Crawford next. I'm personally very, very excited to see what happens. And let's just see. But anyways, thank you all so much for watching. And I'll talk to you all later.